Welcome to the 8th edition of the Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference. It is just a delight to see you here in person. My name is Eddie Lang. I am the local organizing committee chair and work here at the University of Calgary as an emergency physician, also a member of the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare. And I just want to tell you how happy I am to see you here in person at POD after a 3-year, very, very difficult hiatus. And I wanted to thank you for coming because we know it's been difficult, and it's for many of you, it's your first foray since the pandemic, and we acknowledge that this has been very difficult for some of you and are incredibly grateful. Just quickly, I just wanted to see for whom would this be the first ever Preventing Overdiagnosis Conference? All right, well, welcome. That's fantastic to always see new people coming. And I just, so that we don't have, in case we have don't remember to do so, I just wanted to recognize that there's just been a huge amount of planning going into this conference, and wanted to ask all of the members of the local and the international scientific planning committees, which is chaired by Dr. Tim Wilt, who will be presenting to you in a minute. But if you could just stand up so we can give you a round of applause and thank you for your contribution. All right. Now, for those of you who are visiting Canada, we have embraced an important tradition. And it's a tradition that I think is particularly important to this conference. We make it a point to acknowledge the fact that we live and play on land that does not really belong to us. And I think it's particularly relevant because the problem of overdiagnosis, as I think we'll see clearly over the next few days, is resulting in disparities in care, and it's our Indigenous and First Nation populations in Canada that often have the worst health outcomes and suffer most from a social determinants of health perspective. And the problem of overdiagnosis is actually contributing to the problem of underdiagnosis in our friends in these communities who often don't have access to even basic primary care, while their urban brethren, colleagues do. So I just want to specifically say that we are in the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. It includes the Blackfoot Confederacy. This is comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wellesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So thanks again for coming. I will turn the baton over to Dr. Wilt, who is introducing the Lisa Schwartz lecture. Or it's to Stephen. Yeah.
So I think there's supposed to be, nope, a slide. A technical difficulty. Oh, this one. Perfect.
Well, just while we're waiting, forgot to mention that we
Okay,
have
thanks.
20 countries represented at this year's POD meeting, and over 150 delegates. Not everybody here today, some are coming tomorrow. So not as large as Sydney in 2019, but certainly this will be a smaller but mighty POD meeting.
Well, it's not a contest, Eddie. All right. So, hi. So now we've resolved our technical problem. So my name is Stephen Woloshin, and it's my pleasure to introduce this first session, the Lisa Schwartz lecture. And I just want to start with my disclosures. The first disclosure is that I'm thrilled to be here in person with you guys, with a lot of old friends and new friends and future friends. And it's just so wonderful to be in this beautiful city and here for the eighth, as Eddie said, the eighth Preventing Overdiagnosis conference. And I'm so grateful to many people, to Eddie and his colleagues on the local planning committee here in Calgary, the Preventing Overdiagnosis Board, and the scientific committee, and our partners, BMJ, Oxford University, Weiser Health, and the Dartmouth Institute, the staff and volunteers who are working hard to make this happen today, and then most especially to Ruth Davis. I don't know if Ruth is here, but she is, the only word to describe her is she's a colossus, and we wouldn't be here without her. I do have other disclosures, which are here. The most important one is that I'm a founding member of the Preventing Overdiagnosis Board, and in 2013, I helped host the first Preventing Overdiagnosis meeting at Dartmouth. What happened was Ray Moynihan, who some of you know, the brilliant, at the time was a brilliant Australian journalist. Now he's just a brilliant Australian, I guess a brilliant person, just in general. But he had the idea for this meeting. He had the idea, he thought it was important to have a meeting to promote our understanding of overdiagnosis, to define it, to figure out how to measure it and its consequences, and to learn how to communicate about it, and to figure out how to try to mitigate the harms of overdiagnosis. And he reached out to Lisa and to me because we'd been writing on the topic for some time, and we worked together to create this, the first meeting. And the rest is, you know, after some very skillful arm twisting, we agreed to host the meeting. And the rest is history. Most of it is really great history, but some of it is sad. And one very sad bit of the history is that tragically Lisa died in 2018. And as many of you know, she was just this extraordinary human being, just a brilliant thinker, researcher, teacher, mentor, friend. Anyone who met her knows how lucky they were to have had the chance to know her. And I feel like the luckiest person in the world because I got to be married to her for 28 years. But to honor Lisa's memory and her profound and lasting influence on this organization and on the field, the Preventing Overdiagnosis Board instituted the Lisa Schwartz Lecture to honor her memory and to be given each year at the meeting. And I'm really honored today to introduce this year's speaker, another amazing, brilliant, extraordinary woman, Fiona Godley. Fee has so many, I wanted to list some of her accomplishments, but she has so many as a medical doctor, an editor, a writer, and a campaigner that it would take the rest of the meeting to do justice to it. So I'm just gonna highlight one thing, which is to say that if it weren't for, it's no exaggeration to say that the Preventing Overdiagnosis meeting wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Fee's support and wisdom and vision while she was the editor of the British Medical Journal. And on a personal note, I just would say that I'm not sure I would be here today if it weren't for her support and friendship and love. So I want to introduce now the one and only Fiona Godley.
And I'm so honored, Steve, to be giving this lecture in her name. Lisa was, as you have said, a truly exceptional person, and one whom those of us who knew her will never forget. And your partnership with her, Steve, was also truly exceptional. The work you did together has made a lasting impact on healthcare research and practice around the world. There's no doubt about that. Your critiques of the hype around healthcare interventions have been fearless, incisive, always measured, often very funny. And among other things, you and Lisa developed and tested the drugs fact box, which we still hope and expect the FDA to adopt, which would make an enormous difference to people's understanding of the benefits and harms of drugs. You trained countless journalists to help them unpick truth from hype and to better communicate the benefits and risks of tests and treatments. And this work was recognized when you and Lisa received the John P. McGovern Award from the American Writers Association in 2017. But perhaps even more important than this highly prestigious award, you gained the love and respect of the international healthcare research community. And your courage and determination, Steve, in continuing your and Lisa's important work is something to inspire us all. When you invited me to give this lecture, you said I could talk about anything, which I think is another sign of your courage, Steve. So I am going to take this opportunity to pull together two strands that have underpinned much of my work and become increasingly. I realize I should have been showing this picture of you both when I was saying all of that, which I think is a great picture and shows the two of you in such close harmony. So I'm going to pull together two strands that have underpinned much of my work and become increasingly central to my thinking during my time at the BMJ. The first is overdiagnosis and overtreatment, luckily, since that's the subject of this conference. The second is the climate emergency, because in my view, there is perhaps no more important issue for human health. And because overdiagnosis is one way that healthcare contributes to unnecessary carbon emissions. And also because both overdiagnosis and climate change, as we've just been reminded, contribute to social and health inequalities. So I plan to give a quick scoot through the history of our understanding of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, then segue seamlessly into climate change, and finally to suggest some things that we can all do. One of which, sadly, just to be a real party pooper, is to stop holding international conferences like this one until the world has developed zero carbon modes of international travel. I say that with enormous sadness, but I do think it's very important to acknowledge. So, my declarations of interest, I have no financial conflicts that I'm aware of. Much of what I will present was published during my time as editor-in-chief of the BMJ. In the BMJ, I believe medicine is a social and public good, and that most health professionals, the vast majority, strive tirelessly for the good of their patients. I personally prefer not to take pills or undergo tests or treatment if I can avoid them. And just to say, I helped to establish the UK Health Alliance on climate change, and I'm also working on the greener NHS. So, like Steve and Lisa, I grew up equating medical care with love. Those of you who know their story will know that they really began thinking that the more love, the better, the more medicine, the better, the more healthcare, the better. And I come from a medical family, and although my mother, this is a photograph of her, disliked doctors as a breed, she married one, and all four of her children became doctors. That's me at the bottom. And in that environment, medicine was understood to be a good thing, and by extension, the more medical care, the better. As a junior doctor, I, of course, understood that medicine could do harm. I used to worry about it a lot, but mainly I thought through incompetence or failure to do the right thing. And it was only once I joined the BMJ in the early 1990s that I began to understand that there could be such a thing as too much medicine. The first Preventing Overdiagnosis conference, as we've heard, was hosted by Steve and Lisa in Dartmouth in September 2013. It was memorable for the warmth of Steve and Lisa's welcome, and because it felt like a revivalist meeting. We were a small band of believers convening from across the globe in the new and wonderful realization that we were not alone. It was also notable for this swim across the Connecticut River from one state to another. You may recognize some faces there. By that time in 2013, there was already lots of work and thinking being done about the harms of medical excess and of healthcare overreaching itself. And this thinking was happening in the broader context and influences of evidence-based medicine, the Cochrane collaboration, the guideline movement, GRADE, the peer review congress. Just a lot of work from many great writers and thinkers was buzzing about at the time. And by that time, in 2002, the BMJ had published a theme issue on too much medicine about the medicalization of normal life and disease mongering. And this editorial from Ray Moynihan, who you've heard mentioned already, and Richard Smith, the then editor, too much medicine ? I think it's important that they were then at the moment trying to feel their way a bit. But then the subtext, yes, almost certainly. In 2004, Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal, published her book, The Truth About Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What to Do About It. And then in 2005, Ray Moynihan and Alan Cassells published their book, Selling Sickness, How the World's Biggest Pharmaceutical Companies Are Turning Us All into Patients. In 2006, Carsten Jurgensen and Peter Goethe published this important paper in the BMJ about the leaflets sent out to women inviting them for breast screening, which failed to mention the harms of overdiagnosis. I see this paper as really quite iconic. And then at that time, from the BMJ point of view, we had Des Spence, a general practitioner in the UK, who was writing a regular weekly column, often on overtreatment. And this is just one example of him talking about the treatment of depression, not sick, just low, the medicalization of depression. And then in 2007, we have Shannon Brownlee's fantastic book, Overtreated, Why Too Much Medicine is Making Us Sicker and Poorer. And then in 2008 and 2009, these two papers, one on pre-osteoporosis, this idea of being at risk, so that risk factors are becoming diseases, and also from Victor Montori and colleagues, the idea of minimally disruptive medicine, looking at the impact of medicine on patients' lives, simply being a patient, how much work was involved in that. And then later on, Stop the Medicalization of Old Age, recognizing that there was a lot about medicalization going on at that time in life. In 2010, the Archives of Internal Medicine started their overtreatment and overdiagnosis feature called Less is More. This subsequently morphed, the journal morphed into JAMA Internal Medicine. And then in 2012, things accelerated further. We had the Lown Institute holding its first conference on overtreatment. We had Choosing Wisely beginning to ask medical specialist organizations to question the necessity for certain commonly used tests or procedures. And the first of the Selling Sickness conferences were held. And then I wanted to mention this article in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2012 by Blair and Welsh, which I think really neatly, very, very beautifully shows the problem of impact of screening on the incidence of invasive breast cancer, which is the blue line going up, but then across the bottom, the red line showing mortality from metastatic breast cancer not really shifting at all. In 2013, inspired by many of these things, we at the BMJ started our Too Much Medicine campaign. The question mark has gone. We're no longer questioning the evidence for the fact there is too much medicine going on. And we looked to see how we could wind back the harms of too much medicine. And then in 2015, we started a series on overdiagnosis, which was managed by Tessa Richards at the BMJ. Wonderful guidance and authorship from people in this community. Looking at increased detection of smaller and smaller anomalies, and also, so just in this case, the CT pulmonary angiograms, which here you can see as the tests improve, CT pulmonary angiography, we get this growing incidence, both for any diagnosis and the primary diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. But at the bottom, rather like the Welsh study, the Brewer and Welsh study, we've got the completely unshifting mortality. And this is shown again in another paper in the BMJ at that time on thyroid cancer, with all of these improved accuracy of tests, but no impact on mortality. The study, the series was beautifully structured. I can take no credit for it, so I'm happy to praise it to the hilt. And I like very much the fact that it had this feature leap of faith in the middle. So this is about risk of being at risk. So risk factors becoming diseases, in this case, mild hypertension. Should we be detecting and treating mild hypertension? In the middle of this summary box, all of the articles had this leap of faith. And in this case, lowering the threshold for blood pressure, the leap of faith was that will lead to increased diagnosis and decreased mortality. In 2013, there was the patient revolution at the BMJ. We were trying to make sure, in particular, that shared decision-making was improved to reduce unnecessary and harmful interventions. In 2016, Wiser Healthcare was launched as a research collaboration in Australia, focusing on research into overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And this rather useful diagram showing how overdiagnosis and overtreatment work. And then in 2017, this excellent series in The Lancet, Right Care, which had these 4 articles. And I want to just draw attention to the importance of the second article, Evidence for Underuse of Effective Medical Services, which of course we must never forget. The key messages from this from this series were overuse and underuse coexist. Underuse of proven medical care and overuse of unproven care causes suffering to millions of people around the world, and wasteful misallocation of resources. And because most care falls in a grey zone in which benefits and harms are not clear, we must pay attention to preferences of patients. So this was a very important series in The Lancet in 2017. Since then, there have been 2 further preventing overdiagnosis conferences in Copenhagen, in Sydney. But then, of course, the pandemic struck and life rather came to a halt. But COVID itself presents a whole new context for debates about the right levels of surveillance, proper case definition, the scale of the right appropriate public health response, and concerns about the quality of evidence for COVID tests and treatments, all of which I expect is fertile ground for discussion at this conference. So, just to say we haven't been completely asleep at the wheel, other things which you'll be hearing about, I think, later on in the next couple of days. Minna Johansson has worked with Ray Moynihan to develop this series of podcasts, which I also was involved in, on sustainable healthcare. And I think there are 6 really good interviews with wonderful people. I do hope you might listen to those. So what is overdiagnosis? I just thought for those of you for whom this is your first conference, it might be useful to have a reminder, and those of you who've been before might like to be refreshed as well. I don't think I can do better than this very good article in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine by John Broderson, Lisa Carl Hennigan, Jack O'Sullivan, Jeff Aronson, and Steve Wollaston. And their definition is that it is broadly means making people into patients unnecessarily by identifying problems that were never going to cause harm, or by medicalizing ordinary life experiences through expanded definitions of disease. And they very helpfully say what it is. In their mind, it's 3 things: overdetection, identification of abnormalities that were never going to cause harm, or that do not progress, that progress too slowly to cause symptoms or harm during a person's remaining lifetime, or that resolve spontaneously. Overdefinition, which is the lowering of the threshold for a risk factor without evidence that doing so helps people feel better or live longer, and also by expanding disease definitions to include patients with ambiguous or very mild symptoms. And finally, overselling, the moving of the line separating normal from abnormal, so that people with milder and milder symptoms get diagnosed, so more people caught in the net of that diagnosis. They also helpfully clarify what overdiagnosis is not. It's not a false positive result, not synonymous with overtreatment, not synonymous with overtesting, and it's not misdiagnosis. That article, I do think, is worth a read if you want a very good introduction. And as for the impact, these authors say overdiagnosis is one of the most harmful and costly problems in modern healthcare. The harms of overdiagnosis are, of course, direct to the health system and to the patient, but also crucially, as Margaret McCartney points out in her very excellent book, that has impact on the well as well. So too much testing of well people and not enough care for the sick worsens health inequalities and drains professionalism, harming both those who need treatment and those who don't. As for what's driving overdiagnosis, I can't do better than this elegant phrase from Iona Heath in the BMJ in 2013. It's caused by a toxic combination of vested interests and good intentions. And this from a 2017 BMJ article gives a rather more complex and inclusive account of the possible drivers for overdiagnosis and overuse on the left-hand side of the diagram. I'm not going to go into them all. You'll hear about them all through the week. And then possible solutions, which are many, and it just shows the complexity of the problem. And then what can we do about overdiagnosis and overuse? So this comes from this article. I'm just summarizing the main things: encouraging healthy skepticism, reforming incentives, better evaluating definitions, encouraging greater comfort with uncertainty, and promoting the idea of doing nothing. Those are just some of those ones from that previous article I mentioned. How can we check medical excess? Another example of options. I just wanted to draw particular attention to campaigning for more transparent and independent evidence for healthcare, because we know that commercial research tends very strongly to push for more pills, more diagnoses, and more treatments and tests. We've got a lot of evidence for that, which I haven't got time to go into, but I'm sure many of you know it or even produced it. Calling for more independence in this kind of research is something that I feel very strongly about, and we have a campaign that the BMJ launched, again with Ray Moynihan a few years ago, and Helen MacDonald has been at the BMJ, has been leading on that. And just to give credit to the great Doug Altman, sadly no longer with us, who back in 1994 talked about the need for much better research. Less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons, which is at the heart of much of what this overdiagnosis problem needs to address. So this is the stuff of the conference, and we'll be hearing a lot more about the causes, impacts, and solutions to overdiagnosis in the next 3 days. And I'm now going to segue seamlessly into the climate emergency. One of the several reasons to tackle overdiagnosis and too much healthcare in general is its contribution to carbon and other greenhouse gases. And because I'm sure you all know these emissions now threaten our health and indeed our survival on this planet. So sadly on this, the climate science is unequivocal. The world is heating up. The past 7 years have been the 7 warmest ever recorded. And this is a health emergency. In 2022, the IPCC report declared that human-induced climate change is causing dangerous and widespread disruption in nature and affecting the health and well-being of billions of people around the world. And if global temperatures, average global temperatures, increase to 1.5 degrees above centigrade, above the pre-industrial average, there is a high likelihood, say the IPCC, that the planet will tip into irreversible climate change with catastrophic consequences for life on Earth. The current global average temperatures are around 1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial averages. At current rates of warming, the scientists estimate that we will hit the 1.5 degree tipping point in or around 2033. That's extraordinarily in 11 years' time. So we have every reason, I think, to be scared, every right to be scared, and we really need to take this incredibly seriously. Unless this temperature rise is averted, the impact on human health and life will be immense. In the chilling words of Ho Sung Lee, chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, speaking at the launch of the latest IPCC report this year, any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for all. The cause of climate change is clear: human activity. IPCC is absolutely clear about that. Carbon dioxide may not be the most potent of the greenhouse gases, but it is the greatest in quantity, and it stays in the atmosphere for centuries. So emissions now will be with us for many hundreds of years. It's clear that emissions need to be radically reduced, as well as looking at carbon capture and sequestration by various means. That's an important part of this, but those technologies will not be around in a sufficiently soon timeframe to prevent catastrophic climate change in the next 11 years. This is just to show you the relentless buildup of carbon dioxide. Despite world events, the carbon emissions dropped during the COVID pandemic for obvious reasons, but they are recovering to pre-pandemic levels. And in order to bring those down, to prevent a rise above 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're going to have radical action. Climate change is already causing injury, disease, and death around the world through heat waves, wildfires, storms, floods, droughts, increased infectious disease, and mental ill health. Climate change also threatens the very things that lead to good health, like clean air, safe drinking water, nutritious food, safe shelter, financial stability, access to healthcare, and social support. The impacts fall heaviest on the world's poorest, who have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. Meanwhile, rising temperatures are shrinking the area of livable and productive land, displacing more people, adding to the numbers displaced by recent wars that are themselves fueled, as in Ukraine, by the world's addiction to oil and gas. The climate crisis is becoming a humanitarian crisis. Conservative estimates put the number of climate refugees by 2050 at more than 1 billion. Burning fossil fuels also causes air pollution, both inside houses and outside, causing nearly 7 million premature deaths a year from things like asthma, lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, premature birth, and dementia. And this puts a huge and growing burden on healthcare systems. On the plus side, phasing out fossil fuels could avert about 3.6 million premature deaths per year related to air pollution, according to an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Healthcare is, of course, part of the problem, which is where we get round to segueing back towards overdiagnosis. Healthcare's climate footprint is 4.4% of the global total. If it were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet. And with a footprint that size, this article from Arup and others, it becomes clear that healthcare can play a vital role in mitigating man's climate impact. In the UK, the National Health Service has taken a lead, of which we can be proud. The NHS contributes about 4% of emissions in the UK. And in 2020, the NHS became the world's first health service to announce a plan to become net zero, with 2 targets: to be net zero by 2040 for its directly controlled emissions, and to be net zero by 2045 for emissions that the NHS influences. So that's its supply chain. And this rather complicated diagram just shows you a range of different types of emissions. It gives you an idea of the detail with which the NHS is looking at these issues. What I'm told by the NHS, by the Greener NHS, is that they have this significant challenge. On the left of this pie chart are the NHS's direct carbon emissions. Then you've got some personal travel to and from by doctors and patients. Then you've got, on the right-hand side of this diagram, the equipment and supply chain, which is where the most of the carbon is. And of course, that's something the NHS really needs to have influence over. The good news is that there is real scope for transforming healthcare. And this is just to show the work of the Centre for Sustainable Development, Sustainable Healthcare in Oxford. And I think it's really interesting to show this slide where they're showing that the greatest improvement can be through transformation of healthcare. So you'll see the sort of blue arrow-shaped thing is showing that at the moment we have high levels of chronic disease, unsustainable resource use, low-value interventions, pushing people into secondary care to the right of this chart. In the middle, what they're saying is that we could have achieved 30% reductions in carbon and emissions through better use of resources within the existing healthcare system, so fewer people ending up in secondary care. But the biggest prize is if we can really restructure and transform health systems, reducing people going into secondary and primary care through prevention, patient-centered care, and leaner care pathways. The Centre for Sustainable Healthcare has a number of sustainable specialties really actively looking at this, including greener endoscopy. And this is just one example, but looking at all the different places in which endoscopy could be less heavy on its waste. And obviously part of that is to reduce the number of endoscopies as well as the impact of each one. Sadly for you researchers, I'm afraid you don't escape the need to transform. This article says that academic researchers are amongst the highest emitters, I don't know compared with whom, primarily as a result of emissions from flying to conferences, project meetings, and field work. And I think it's rather a good statement that we, the authors of this paper, find no clear obstacles to justify an exemption for the research community from the emission reduction targets applied elsewhere. Sorry about that. There are things we can all individually do, and I was quite cheered by this article in The Guardian in the UK, which talks about some research done in Leeds, which have come up with 6 things that cost nothing and that if done by everyone in wealthy countries could cut global carbon emissions by a quarter. Seems too good to be true, but here they are: eating a largely plant-based diet, buying no more than 3 new items of clothing a year. I suppose buying secondhand would be fine. Keeping electrical products for longer, taking no more than 1 short-haul flight and 1 long-haul flight every 8 years, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Get rid of your personal motor vehicles or hold on to the one you have for longer, and make at least 1 shift in various things, such as insulating your home or changing your pension supplier. It seems too good to be true, but if that's the case, let's all do that. We must also, though, keep up pressure on governments, banks, businesses and institutions. And you can do this by joining or supporting organisations such as the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, which I have to say I was part of the setting up. The BMJ is a member, as is the Lancet, the Royal Colleges in the UK and the BMA. And they recently coordinated an editorial published in more than 200 health journals calling for urgent action on the climate crisis, which has been quite influential, I would like to feel. The World Bank has also withdrawn its support for oil and gas extraction. And the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently called for such investment economic and moral madness. So perhaps you should check, if you could, with your university or funder, whether they have divested from fossil fuels and ideally reinvested in alternatives. I should say that the Wellcome, which is one of the largest funders of medical research, has not done so. It still has in its investment portfolio, which is enormous, JP Morgan and other major investors in fossil fuels. And there's plans afoot to try to put pressure on Wellcome and other recalcitrant funders to divest. Antonio Guterres has recently gone on to say that climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuels infrastructure is moral and economic madness. That was the quote I already gave. You might see this, as I do, as an endorsement for climate activism. And personally, I have been involved in climate activism for quite some time, and this latest picture to the right there is me having a rather tricky conversation with a member of the British police, asking me to move off from Lambeth Bridge Road. You'll see in the background a man in hospital scrubs. This was a very wonderful, peaceful protest by Doctors for Extinction Rebellion, and we blocked Lambeth Bridge, and very respectful. And I personally was not arrested that day, but others were, and it was an extremely moving example of dignity, both on behalf of the doctors and nurses, but also of the police who were policing that particular protest. So, in summary, what can you do as an individual, as a professional, as a citizen? You can become informed and share information with others. You can get involved in how your organization is responding to the climate emergency. You can get your organization to disinvest, as I've said, from fossil fuels, or to declare a climate emergency. It might seem a small thing, but it can have influence. You can, I think, should review your own clinical pathways and your waste management. And there's lots of support now for ways to do this. And as I've mentioned, researchers don't get off the hook. You can and should, I think, review your research processes and practices, and if possible, reduce the amount that you fly and travel around the world, which is a shame. And I think leading by personal example has to be an enormously important part of this. There is a better future worth fighting for. The world doesn't need to be a harder, more difficult place just because we find different solutions for looking after the planet. As one example, global action required to meet the 1.5 degree target is estimated in this paper in Nature Communications, is estimated to deliver an economic benefit of some enormous sum that I can't even get my head around, $264 trillion to $610 trillion by 2100. So, there is a plus side to action against carbon emissions and climate change. And there will be substantial positive benefits to health and society if we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Cleaner air, cleaner water, active travel and plant-based diets will improve our physical and mental well-being, as will engagement in rewilding and community action. We could achieve greater global justice and social equity, restored biodiversity, fewer displaced people, fewer pandemics, perhaps fewer wars. Tackling overdiagnosis can help. Thank you, and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, brilliant talk. You're the best, although you're depressing. So apparently we have a few minutes extra for if anyone has questions. If you're willing to take a few questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. If anyone has a question, just raise your hand. Yes, there's a question in the back. Oh, it's Tara.
Steve, just in case I can't hear Tara, I can hear you, but I can't.
Yeah, I'll repeat it.
Sorry, you'll tell me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, hi. Yes, I can.
Yes.
Hi, Tara.
Hi. So thank you for that. It was important. I always see this disconnect between the number of years of targets. So you said that 11 years was critical, yet the NHS has these goals for 2040 and 2050. Does that mean people are not being aggressive enough or radical enough? How do we reconcile that, and how do we shorten it? And what will it take? Thank you.
Yes, Tara. I mean, I think it's a very, very difficult one, isn't it? I think the thing is that the IPCC have been saying what they've been saying for some time. Emissions haven't really tailed off, and therefore they've revised to some extent their estimates. So the 2033 one is the one I've been told, around that time is the latest estimate. I think with the NHS, they're trying to be realistic, because if they promise something they can't deliver, then that's no good. So they've realistically looked at what they think they can achieve. But all of us feel, I think, that these things have got to happen sooner. I mean, and there are things that could happen sooner if there was a political and financial and economic will. Now, one of the interesting conversations I had recently was about scenarios. COVID struck and we stopped, didn't we? The world stopped. And obviously with enormous hardship and upset and just, and ongoing problems. I mean, it was a huge thing, but we can stop if we need to. And some of the researchers I've been talking to in Cambridge have saying, well, let's start planning for more urgent scenarios. What if we, some of you will have seen Don't Look Up, the film, where they had 6 months before the meteorite was going to strike, and they could have stopped it, but they didn't, because of all the reasons we know. But the question is, what would a more urgent scenario look like? And that's really what you're asking. And I think we absolutely there should be research looking into that. What would have to happen to get us to reduce emissions sufficiently to prevent overshooting 1.5 degrees centigrade. And I think it would be radical changes to our lifestyle, and that is a very frightening prospect.
Okay, there's another question.
Hello, Fred Granis, Long Beach, California. I was intrigued by your comparison to the Dartmouth meeting, which I attended. And when I came home, I said that I thought that it was like a religious fundamentalist tent show. And I'm surprised to hear you agree with me on that. The question I would like to ask you is, do you think it's a good thing for a scientific conference to be comparable to a revival meeting? And second of all, do you think that revival feeling still exists in this meeting?
Well, thanks for that question. The fact that you're here, or there rather, suggests that you didn't find it too off-putting, which I'm very glad to hear. But I think you're right to ask that question, and I would agree. I think in general, no, I don't think it's a good thing. I think certainly if that feeling blurs into the work and into being less scrupulous or less diligent in the evaluations, and then I think that's a real worry. And I'm glad to say that I don't think that has happened. I think the plea that we would all make, and I think thankfully has been kept to, is that one has to be even more scrupulous and skeptical and apply even greater scrutiny when evidence seems to confirm one's tendencies or biases, or evidence seems to contradict that, and you want to be overcritical. I think it's a really important thing that you raise. The revivalist meeting feeling was partly we'd travelled so far. I came over in what I think was a single engine plane across the mountains into Dartmouth. I was wondering whether the pilot had a heart attack, what would happen. And Dartmouth has that feeling about it as well, if you'll forgive me. I don't know if anyone agrees with me. It's the most beautiful place and rather unreal in some ways. And suddenly there we all were. And I think some people had genuinely thought they were working alone at the coalface and meeting other people who were doing similar work and coming to similar conclusions, I think was really striking. But I think it's something to guard against, even though it's wonderful to get together and to find allies. And of course, one needs to make research collaborations, and that's really what part of the conference is for. But I think absolutely to maintain the highest possible critique about one's own biases is crucial. So religious analogies, I think we should try to avoid.
Thank you, Fee. There's another question.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, we go. I'm Ian Johnson. I'm from Glasgow. I live in Calgary now. I was listening to Eddie talking on the radio yesterday lunchtime and about overdiagnosis, and someone called in who I think identified herself as a ICU nurse and was talking about the potential for, misdiagnoses. And we were at a Choosing Wisely Canada conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was someone made the comment of another radio show out of, I think he's out of Toronto, it's an Emerge doc, that was talking about how, all these terrible missed diagnoses. I just wonder if I think you know why I'm here, because I disagree with the people, but I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the whole missed diagnosis thing that seems to be getting argued back against the concept of overdiagnosis. Are
you saying missed or miss?
Missed, I think, was what the lady was kind of talking about already. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think that's another interesting thing. I had toyed with the idea of giving a completely different talk. But then I had promised myself when I stepped down from the BMJ that I would always talk about climate change. So I'm going to become a very dull person to invite to speak. But the other talk I was going to give was about my own personal experiences of the importance of diagnosis. And, I myself have not had too much, well, a little bit of, needing to push for a diagnosis, but members of my family, that has been, I hope I'm answering your question, Ian, but forgive me if I'm rambling here. But what I wanted to say is that a weird combination of symptoms, which seemed to be causing trouble and was unexplained. And people were saying, we don't know what this is. And because I'm medical, I was able in both cases, both my son and my husband, to make rather startlingly interesting diagnoses. So I'm very proud of it. But I think if my husband and son had not had a medic in the family who was really clued in and keyed in, they would have remained undiagnosed. And I think they would have gone on worrying about these aren't serious symptoms, but symptoms that would otherwise have led them down all sorts of paths. In one case, my son has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is he has it very mildly, and the concatenation of symptoms is very hard to unpick if you don't think it through. And my husband's got a very, very small acoustic neuroma, which again was not diagnosed, and I had to ask the radiologist 3 times to look again at the scan. I just said, "Can you please exclude an acoustic neuroma?" And the third time, they rather shamefully came back and said there was one. So, I think if I've understood your question, missed diagnoses are a real worry. And but at the same time, a small thing such as the one my husband has, I have his permission to mention this because I was going to give this other talk. Does it matter? It matters because it's causing him symptoms. If it was picked up as an incidentaloma, you might argue it should have been left well alone. I don't know if I've answered your question, Ian.
More about the controversy it seems to be, and that there's people who are almost like
Sorry, I can't.
Almost against this concept of overdiagnosis.
Yeah, I'll repeat it, Fee. Although not in my accent isn't as nice, unfortunately. But he has a microphone.
I've got the microphone back. I think it was more it seemed that the people that I was listening to on the radio were almost like arguing against this concept of overdiagnosis. Like overdiagnosis is a bad thing and we shouldn't be talking about it. We shouldn't be trying to do it. And because all of these people are having their breast cancers missed, was what the chap in Toronto was talking about. He's an Emerge doc with a radio show. But so it's are we fighting a battle against another force? I guess.
Yes. Well, I know. I think the thing I would say about that is, I've sometimes been criticised for not emphasising the underdiagnosis problem, and my response in recent years was, but it's so counter. There's so much pushing for the treatment and the diagnosis that we need to push the over. We need to emphasise there is this risk of overdiagnosis. But I think also one of the problems for overdiagnosis is that you can't tell it in the individual patient at all easily. It has to be done very far retrospectively or in population studies, and so it takes a lot of judgment on the part of the clinician and the screener and the really informing the patient ahead of time, doesn't it, to make sure that they've understood what they're going in for and what the uncertainties around it are. I mean, obviously there are incompetent mammographers and there are incompetent pathologists who we have scandals occasionally in the UK where a whole slew of cervical smears were badly looked at, so that's just incompetence. But a system that's running well, I think we have to believe the really good research that breast cancer screening, there is overdiagnosis and the women need to be informed about that. I don't know really what else to say. It's very hard in the individual case, isn't it, to be able to prove it.
We have time for one more question. Barry Kramer.
Yeah, Fee, this is Barry Kramer. Just a brief comment and then a question about the second portion of your talk. You're right. One of the holy grails in the whole field is identifying overdiagnosis at the individual level. And so I'm just going to point out that at these meetings, there will be a panel session, symposium on the role of specialists in generating but also mitigating the problem of overdiagnosis. And a couple of the talks will get down to the level of how can we take the next step of identifying overdiagnosis for the individual patient to get better informed consent about treatment decisions. But the question is about the second part of your talk. I'm not an expert, but I have heard and read information about fully electric cars. And I noticed in your talk you put emphasis on holding on to the car that you have for a much longer period of time, and that certainly would help. But my understanding is, although we measure carbon footprint for the planet as a closed system, we make the mistake of measuring the carbon footprint for electric cars just around the individual car, and the footprint becomes zero, but the manufacturer of the car, in order to make the batteries and the materials and so forth, actually exceeds by a good amount currently the manufacturer of gas-run engines. And so it takes years to recoup that. With fully electric cars, it is recouped much faster with hybrid cars. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes. No, I think that's a very good point, Barry. Nice to hear you. I think the holding on to your existing car is it's nice to know that, because we all perhaps would like that outcome. We've actually bought a fully electric car. On the knowing exactly what you said, that the carbon involved in producing that, not to mention the precious metals and all of the batteries, etc., is a challenge. But I think if you're going to buy a new car, buy electric. That's what I would say. I think hybrid. Sorry, I'm no expert. I don't know enough about this. But hybrid, I think, is being found to have horrible emissions. That they're not being entirely straight about. So what I'm being told and what I've acted on is if you're buying a new car, buy electric. The sales of new cars in Sweden, in Norway, I'm told that 70% of new cars are electric now, because they've made it much cheaper to buy an electric car in Norway. In the UK, it's much lower than that. I don't know what it's like in America. We've got to just, I'm afraid, increase the cost of fossil fuels and try and make sure that electric cars are charged on clean energy. And one has the lovely benefit of driving around, not polluting the local air, and children not getting asthma because you're pushing out fumes. So if that's worth the cost, for me, that's worth the cost.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So we've run out of time, but I want to just thank Fee again for a wonderful talk and welcome everyone to the meeting.